A lot of people have been asking me for my take on recent events. Many commentators think we're in the midst of an attempted revolution, something like the Chinese Cultural Revolution. But this is not the case. The Cultural Revolution, at least here in Britain, happened sometime in the late 1990s, as documented by Peter Hitchens. I think it's more accurate to think about what is happening in terms of a counter-revolution from a system that feels under threat. In other words, a retrenchment of the current status quo, using seemingly autonomous shock troops in a bid to head off a perceived countercultural force. Now, I read a paper recently, which I've linked in the show notes, about how totalitarian regimes sponsor mass demonstrations in order to reinforce their own power. So let me quote a few extracts. In normal times of relative quiescence and state dominance, mass demonstrations organized by autocratic regimes serve multiple purposes. They can be used by regimes as a way of controlling local state agents or obtaining information about local circumstances that might otherwise be inaccessible. They can become ritualized and serve as a way of reinforcing domination to the population. They can be used to signal support for state policies to either foreign or domestic audiences, and they can be used as a prophylactic against the emergence of organized opposition or as a way of marginalizing existing opposition movements. And then a little bit later on, but more often, state-sponsored mass mobilization in the context of revolutionary challenge has been used as a means of defending an incumbent regime against waves of opposition-led popular mobilization, what I refer to in this paper as counter-revolution. In a recent article, Slater and Smith defined counter-revolution as collective and reactive efforts to defend the status quo and its varied range of dominant elites against a credible threat to overturn them from below. So here you have to understand that I'm suggesting that the direct revolutionary challenge in the current events comes from the tumultuous political events of 2016, what is typically dismissed in the media as populism, and that is the revolutionary force. And the counter-revolutionary force represents the old status quo, which is under threat from this revolutionary force. Bear this in mind as we continue. Counter-revolutionary mobilization instead consists of parts that are pulled together, usually by agents of the state or by those affiliated with the state. Usually some element of counter-revolutionary mobilization relies on selective incentives and patronage networks deployed by the regime, sometimes through payment and sometimes through hierarchical authority. Moreover, autonomous counter-revolutionary participation can be motivated less by enthusiasm for the incumbent regime than by dislike of the social forces represented within revolutionary movements. So you can see here in the current situation, counter-revolutionary forces harbour an intense hatred for those who support the revolutionary movement, who keep making themselves heard in inconvenient democratic votes. Now, as we continue through this paper, you need to bear this in mind because it is not altogether intuitive. So, for example, in what I'm about to read, the revolutionary movement, which started in the votes of 2016, are akin to the Bolshevik forces, while the counter-revolutionary forces that we've been seeing in recent events are more akin to the supporters of the Tsarist regime, which is the opposite way to the way in which most people would think of it. So anyway, let's continue. By the early 20th century, a number of autocratic regimes began experimenting with yet another model for using civilian mobilization for countering revolutionary challenges: the organization of counter-revolutionary mass movements and parties. In the midst of the revolution of 1905 in Russia, for instance, a series of counter revolutionary mass movements such as the Union of Russian People and its affiliates like the Black Hundred burst onto the political scene, organizing demonstrations, street fights, pogroms, assassinations, and vigilante actions aimed at defending the monarchy, defeating revolutionary threats, and preserving aristocratic privilege and Russian ethnic dominance throughout the Russian Empire. While the leadership of the movement consisted of members of the upper and middle classes with close connections to the police, the rank and file were recruited largely from workers, peasants, shopkeepers, priests, and professionals, as well as criminals and the unemployed. Police actively abetted the development of the movement, even printing pogromist leaflets in some instances. Since the early 20th century, civilian counter-revolutionary mobilization has become a standard tool by which autocratic regimes seek to undermine revolutionary threats. There are a number of reasons why this has been the case, and why, in addition to using police or military repression or engaging in concessions, autocratic regimes turn to civilian counter-revolutionary mobilization as a means for undermining revolutions. For one thing, even when counter-revolutionary mobilization is entirely involuntary and relies solely upon hierarchical authority or selective incentives, it demonstrates to elites and to the population the continuing power of the regime and its ability to control institutions and command popular resources, thereby raising the costs of defection. As Graham Robertson has noted, maintaining the incumbent advantage depends to a significant extent on maintaining an air of invincibility or permanence and convincing other potential leaders and elites that their best hopes for advancement lie in continuing to work together with the ruling group rather than organizing against it. If the success of revolutionary challenges depends on the ability of oppositions to stimulate defections from within the ruling coalition, then demonstrating the continuing coherence of the regime's institutional control is one way to render defection less attractive. Violent clashes between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary civilians can also provide opportunities for the regime to justify a declaration of emergency and imposition of political order, thereby justifying harsher and more systematic government repression of revolutionary challenges. Of course, violence against protesters carried out by civilian counter-revolutionaries can also fail in the face of large-scale mobilization, playing instead into revolutionary narratives. Such was the case in the infamous Battle of the Camel in Tahrir Square on February 2nd, 2011. Neil Ketchley has documented the steady growth of pro-Mubarak demonstrations in Egypt beginning on January the 28th, the Friday of Anger. Most pro-regime protests coincided with anti-regime demonstrations and were used as opportunities for Mubarak supporters to harass and repress the opposition. And finally, counter-revolutionary mobilization, if sufficiently large, can visibly demonstrate the limits of support for revolutionary opposition within society, thereby undermining revolutionary claims to popular legitimacy, particularly in an age in which visual images of crowds displayed on television or supplied by social media. Crowd size can signal critical information to potential participants whose decision to participate may rely on the levels of participation by others. In Curran's terms, the larger the size of pro-government crowds, the higher the threshold for individuals to reveal their true preferences over regime change, and the less likely bandwagoning with the opposition becomes. Moreover, the more divided society appears to be over the issue of regime change, and the more those members of society who favour the status quo are willing to mobilise in defence of the regime, the more hollow opposition claims to represent the preferences of the people would appear to be. Thus, one strategy of regimes facing credible revolutionary threats is to mobilize large crowds in support of the status quo. Counter-demonstrations involving large numbers require more than just selective incentives to fuel participation, and societal divisions such as ethnicity, religion, region, or clan are likely to be a more reliable source for counter-revolutionary mobilization than material incentives, as those who support depends primarily on material incentives are more likely to defect when faced with persistent, large-scale resistance. But while counter-revolutionary mobilization that relies upon societal divisions may be more loyal, it is also less likely to be controllable by incumbent regimes. Most counter-revolutionary mobilizations are composite in character, involving a mix of participation based on material incentives and participation based on societal divisions. The latter can be motivated more by dislike against the social forces represented by the revolutionary opposition rather than by loyalty to the incumbent regime, but ironically is less likely to defect than those whose participation in civilian counter-revolutionary mobilization is based solely on patronage or on selective incentives. So I'd encourage you to think about what is happening in the terms I've described, rather than buying into the fiction that protesters are out in opposition to the current regime. They are unmistakably its strongest supporters, a counter-revolutionary force. As I've said so many times before, if you're pushing at an open door, you are not a radical. Now get out.